So with Unreal 4.26, one of the new features that has been introduced is the Enhanced Input plugin. I'm going to show you how you can use this plugin to create widgets that change their appearance depending on the user input keys, and how you can easily rebind user input keys for any action you like. So first of all, what you need to do is enable the plugin, which you can easily do under Settings, Plugins, and if you type Enhanced, that is, you have to restart your editor and then you can use all the functions associated with the plugin. So one of the special things about this new plugin is that it's using a bunch of new files. There are two types. First of all, the actions, and then the input mapping context. The way you can imagine this is the actions are basically any particular input you could trigger. So for example, here I have a sprint action. You can set like different parameters like axes and bools. So in this case, this is a bool, which means you can just press it or not press it and it will return true when you press it and false if it's not being pressed anymore. Very simple stuff. But it's also very powerful. You can see there's a bunch of parameters you have access to customize how these actions interpret your input. And there's also modifiers, but all of this is not really necessary for what we're doing today. The second file type, the input mapping context, is what you basically can imagine as your entire key configuration. So this holds all the actions, and then for each action you can assign hotkeys, and you can again assign different modifiers. So this can be useful, for example, if you have a movement axis, right? With the gamepad, it's pretty straightforward. You're just using the y-axis as the input. But with a mouse and keyboard, you want W to go like forward and S to go backward. So you can just add a modifier to negate the input of S, right? So instead of going from 0 to 1, if you press S, it will go from 0 to -1. First, I'm going to go over how you can rebind your keys. This is actually not that complicated. So what you need is a function kind of like this. I built it inside my character, but usually you would build this in a widget or something. Like you have a button that you press to rebind the key, but in my case I just put it in the character so it's easier to demo. And I built a very simple function here. You just need these two inputs. One is the action that you want to rebind the associated keys for, and then there's the new key that you want to set. In this case, right, I have the action coming in, and then I'm going straight into this macro, which is a custom macro that I created myself. So basically what this macro does, again, it has an input, which is a mapping context and an action. The mapping context is basically your player's key bindings, like their entire key bindings. You should store this in a variable somewhere. So the cool thing about this is that you can very easily switch between different presets. Like in my case, for example, I have like two different controller layouts, and then I have another third preset, which is the preset that the player can customize for themselves. So I'm putting in this key mapping context, and then I'm putting in the action, and what this macro returns is all the keys that are bound to this action in this context. So back to the macro here. Basically what I'm doing is I'm defining a local array of keys. These dark blue variables are keys. And I'm doing this because there might be multiple keys bound to any action, right? So for example, in my case, I have a controller input and then a keyboard input. So I have to create an array so that all the keys that are bound to this action can be returned to me. So in this case, right, I'm just taking the input mapping context and I'm getting all the mappings, doing a little loop action here where basically if you have a mapping, you will get this, but this is not super useful, so you can just split the struct. And then one of the returning things you get is the action, and then you also get the key, right? Those are the two things that we want. So in this case, I'm comparing the action to my input action. So basically I'm checking like all these actions that are contained within this context. Most of them are not relevant, right? I only want to check the keys for this one action. And then if the action matches, I'm adding the associated keys to my local array here. And then once I'm done, I'm just returning the array of keys. So I got all the keys that are associated with this action now. And next what I'm doing is, since again, it could be multiple keys, I am checking if it's a gamepad key, because in our case today, I'm just going to rebind the keyboard key, right? Usually you want your gamepad controls and your keyboard controls to be separate, because you don't want to override a gamepad key with a keyboard key, right? So in this case, right, I'm checking, okay, it's not a gamepad key, and then I'm unmapping this key. You take the context, right, this is the target, then you take the action, which is my input action where I want to rebind the key, and then the key is the previously assigned key that I got returned from my macro here. So I'm unbinding all the existing bindings to this key, right? Because if you just add a new binding, you will just create more and more keys associated with one action, but usually you don't want that. You want to overwrite the old key mapping. So once this is done, I'm mapping the new key. Same thing, I'm getting the context. Then I'm getting the action where I want to overwrite the key, and I'm mapping the key to it. Pretty straightforward. So I have this little print screen here to basically debug, and then I have a little bit of logic that I'm going to explain. So basically the way that I set it up in my case is I have like one input, and this will trigger that now I'm listening for a key to be remapped, right? You will have to do this in some way as well. Usually, as I mentioned, probably this would be like a button in your interface that if you click it, it's going to listen for the new key. So in my case, right, I'm setting a bool, I'm listening for a key, and then I'm also defining which action I want to rebind. So in my case, I have just hard-coded an action. Usually, like if you have a button, you would have something like, for example, you have your binding for the attack, right? The attack function. And to rebind it, you have to click on that specific field. And there you would define in the widget that which action is going to have its key remapped. The next action then is any key, and this you cannot trigger in a widget, so you will have to have this happen in an actor somewhere. That's why I kind of just put it in a character. So this will listen for any key input at all. So this is only going to trigger, right, if I set the condition that I am listening for a key to be rebound. And if this is true, then I'm calling my function, and input to be remapped, right, is the one that I just defined. And this is the function that I just showed you. And after I'm done, I'm resetting my variables so that I'm no longer listening for inputs. This is basically how you rebind a key. Now for the next step, which is the widget part, how do you change the way a widget displays itself depending on your key mapping? So in my example, right, I have this super simple widget, the interact widget, like it will show up whenever you can interact with something and show you the hotkey. So by default, this is E, but I've created a little function to change. Basically, this is a text, and this will just change the text. And it's really quite simple. So in my case, because I have the key mapping stored on the player pawn, perhaps not the best thing to do, but works for me. So I get the key mapping from the pawn, and then once again I'm getting an action. And here I have to find the action in a variable. So in this case, it's the interact action. And I'm calling my macro again, right, that I showed previously, this one, and it returns the keys that are assigned to it. So in this case, right, there will only be one key assigned because I set it up so that you're only listening for one key input, right? So in my case, this will have a controller key assigned and one keyboard key assigned, which is probably the way that it should always be. And that means that I will only return this once, right? If you had multiple keys assigned to the same action, then this wouldn't quite work because it would only show the last key assigned to it. But anyway, I know that this is only going to return one keyboard key to me. Nevertheless, I have this little loop where I'm checking, is it a gamepad key? And if it's not a gamepad key, then I'm setting the text for the keyboard button, right? So by default, this is E. But whenever I call this function, it will change the text to whatever this input action that I have defined here is set. And so, for example, in this case, I have this interact widget placed in the world on things that you can interact with. And so basically whenever I'm showing this interact prompt. I'm executing the function on it to check what key is assigned to the input action. So let's take a look at this in practice. Okay, so first of all, what I'm going to do is press my arbitrary debug key to rebind a key, right? So I'm pressing 1, and you can see in the top left, it's listening for input, and now I'm pressing a button, let's say J. And J now is my new interact hotkey. And if I look at this shopkeeper, you can see it's displaying J. I press J, and he executes the function that he's supposed to. So now let's change the hotkey. I'm going to change it to, let's say, B. And you can see my widget is displaying B to me. So there you have it, straightforward and easy way of assigning new keys to any input action and changing a widget to display that new hotkey that you assigned to the associated action. If you want to do this with a controller, it's a little bit more complicated, of course, because right now I can only get the display name of the new key and just plug it into the text. That's super straightforward, but of course this would be with a controller a little more complicated because you have to use an image for the controller button. But yeah, so this is just about how you can do it with the keyboard. From here on, it should be quite easy for you to figure out how to do it with the controller, right? There's no large difference other than how you assign the final image on your widget. Otherwise, all the logic is basically the same. So I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial on how to use the new enhanced input system for Unreal Engine 4.26. A little reminder, right, this is brand new, this is only available in 4.26, so if you have an older engine version, this plugin is not going to be available to you. Alright, thanks for watching, and if you have any questions about how the system works, feel free to post in the comments.